There's something about cabins in the woods that draws people in the promise of quiet, of solitude, of that perfect kind of isolation where the only sounds are wind brushing against the trees and the crackling of a dying fire. But that same silence, it's the kind that can swallow you whole. I've always believed that deep in the wilderness, past the roads no one maintains anymore, past where GPS loses signal, there are places that don't quite belong to us. Places where the line between human and something else starts to blur. Most people never see those places, but those who do rarely come back unchanged. Tonight, I want to tell you about 3 people who stepped into that kind of silence. 3 cabins each, built for peace, but claimed by something that feeds on fear, loneliness, and the sound of a door opening in the dark. The first was tucked in a valley between the cold Montana mountains. 2 brothers spending the weekend away, surrounded by forests older than memory. The second sat just beyond a forgotten ghost town, where one man returned to the cabin his father built, only to discover someone else had been waiting there, someone who still remembered his father's name. And the last cabin, it was never meant to be a place of horror at all. A modern home near the Appalachian Trails. A cousin's gift. A sanctuary that turned into a trap the moment night fell. Each story different, each story true, and together, they whisper one lesson most of us refuse to believe, that when you go deep enough into the woods, it isn't nature you need to fear. It's what waits for you when you start to think you're alone. I don't tell these stories to scare you for the sake of it. I tell them because these are the kind of stories that stay with people, the kind they try to explain away later, blaming exhaustion or bad dreams or the wind. But you can't explain the sound of footsteps outside your cabin door when you know for certain you're the only one within miles. You can't explain a man calling your father's name years after he's dead. And you can't explain why, when the police finally come, the footprints outside have already disappeared, as if the woods themselves swallowed the truth. So, turn off the lights, lock your doors, and remember sometimes, when the forest goes silent, it isn't because the world is at peace. It's because something out there is listening, waiting for you to breathe, to move, to make a sound. Because once it knows you're there, you'll never be truly alone again. It was supposed to be just another weekend getaway. 2 brothers, a cabin tucked between the snow-brushed Montana mountains, and the kind of silence that feels too perfect to question. Johnny and I had done this kind of thing all our lives long. Hikes, campfires, and quiet nights where the world seemed to pause. We'd always thought of the woods as our second home, and maybe that's why, when things started to feel wrong, we both tried too hard to pretend it was nothing. That first day was calm. The air smelled like pine and smoke from our small fire. The cabin sat low in a dip between 2 ridges, hidden under tall fir trees that blocked most of the Sunday. By the time evening came, the light faded faster than I expected, like the mountains were closing in around us. Johnny said he was going to take a quick walk before it got dark. He didn't bring a flashlight or a bag, just his hands in his jacket pockets and that familiar grin of his. I remember half sleeping on the couch, watching him step out into the fading light. The door creaked shut behind him, and for a while, the sound of the wind was the only thing moving in that house. I must have dozed off. When I woke again, the fire had burned low, and the sky outside the window was black. The clock read just after 8, too dark for any short walk, and Johnny still wasn't back. I tried calling out his name once through the door just to feel less uneasy, but the woods don't echo the way you'd expect. They swallow your voice instead. That silence hit me harder than I like to admit. I grabbed my headlamp, a small flashlight, and started down the narrow trail behind the cabin. The trees pressed close on both sides. I could see my breath now, thick, white clouds in the beam of my light. Every few seconds, I'd stop, look behind me, tell myself I was just overreacting. But the further I went, the heavier the air felt, like something was moving when I wasn't. Then, maybe 10 minutes in, I saw him. Johnny was coming down the trail, walking fast, head down, the light from my flashlight catching the sweat on his face. He wasn't running, but it looked like every step was an effort to stay calm. I called out, relieved at first. But before I could ask what happened, he told me to turn around, his voice low, urgent. We walked back side by side, barely talking until we were inside again. Doors locked, both of us breathing like we just sprinted a mile. He said someone had been watching him. A man standing between the trees, half hidden by the trunks. At first, Johnny thought it was another hiker until the man started following him along the trail. Not close enough to attack, but close enough to be deliberate. Johnny said he waited for dark, hoping to lose him before coming back. I laughed it off, trying to calm both of us. Probably some guy with a nearby cabin, or a hunter heading back late. But deep down, I didn't believe myself. We cooked dinner. We even sat outside by the fire for a while, pretending everything was fine. But I noticed the way Johnny kept glancing at the tree line every few minutes. The way he jumped a little when a branch snapped somewhere behind the cabin. Neither of us said it out loud, but we were both listening for footsteps. That night the forest was too quiet. Even the crickets seemed to stop singing. The next morning came heavy and gray. We pushed through. It went on a 6-hour hike up the mountain, like nothing had happened. Maybe we wanted to prove to ourselves the woods weren't out to get us. By the time we made it back, we were too tired to care about anything but rest. Johnny said he was going to shower. I lay down on the couch again, half watching the window light fade into that same mountain dusk. That's when something felt off. I couldn't tell what, at first just an itch in my gut. The sound of the water pump never came on. No pipes creaking, no running water. "Johnny?" I called out. No answer. The floorboards creaked under my feet as I walked down the hallway. When I reached the bedroom, I knocked. Still nothing. Then I cracked the door open. He was there, Johnny kneeling in the far corner of the room, eyes wide, shaking his head at me. Not angry, terrified. He didn't even speak, just mouthed, "Don't come in." For a split second, I didn't understand. Then I saw why. A man was standing just a few feet from him. Filthy clothes, hair matted with grease. Eyes so tired they almost looked hollow. But behind that emptiness was something else, something wild. I didn't think, didn't process, just charged. The man raised a gun, but I tackled him before he could aim. Johnny grabbed the weapon, and the three of us fell against the wall in a blur of screams and chaos. The man was strong, his movements jerky and inhuman. He didn't say a word, just shrieked, clawing at us like a trapped animal. We finally tied him up with a curtain cord, enough to keep him still. Johnny held him down while I ran for the car. We left everything but our lives behind. When we returned later with the police, the cabin was empty. The ropes were on the floor. The man was gone. They traced the gun to someone missing for 5 years, another man. Last seen 50 miles from where we'd stayed. But the description didn't match. Whoever attacked us wasn't the man who owned that gun. He must have taken it from him. And for the first time in my life, I realized how thin the line is between being the one who tells the story and being the story itself. After Montana, I started thinking a lot about how easy it is to lose someone in the woods. Sometimes it's the distance. Sometimes it's time itself. But sometimes it's something waiting for you to arrive. The second story comes from a man named Elliot. He'd just lost his father, a quiet, hardworking man who used to talk about a cabin he built deep in the forest outside a dying town. After the funeral, Elliot found the old map in a box of his father's things. No coordinates, just a rough hand-drawn trail leading into nothing. Maybe it was grief, maybe curiosity. But a few weeks later, he packed his truck and drove 6 hours to see that place for himself. He said the drive felt like slipping out of the world. The farther he went, the more abandoned everything became. Roads cracking apart, old barns sagging into the fields. The kind of silence that only exists when no one's lived there for decades. By the time he reached the town, it wasn't even a town anymore. Just hollow storefronts, broken windows, and a sign so faded you couldn't read the name. Elliot parked behind an old gas station and followed a narrow path into the woods, carrying his gear on his back. The trees there were tall and thin, bending slightly as though leaning in to listen. 2 miles later, he found the cabin still standing, against all odds. He described it as something out of a photograph that should have burned years ago. Vines wrapped around the corners, the roof half caved, moss creeping through the logs. Inside, the air smelled like mold and rusted nails. Someone had been there. There were old cans, dirty blankets, signs of squatters, but not recent ones. Maybe a few years old. Elliot pushed the trash aside and set up his sleeping bag in the only clean corner left. He said the quiet that night wasn't peaceful, it was heavy, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. Every time he drifted towards sleep, something woke him. Not a noise, not a movement, just the feeling that someone was awake with him, right outside the edge of the firelight. By sunrise, he'd only slept in fragments. His head ached, but he still wanted to stay. Wanted to see the sunrise from the place his father once called home. He made coffee on a small camping stove and wandered through the trees until he reached a hill overlooking the valley. From there, he could see the remains of the town below, empty, still, lost to time. But in one of the buildings, there was light. Just a faint glow behind a window, flickering like candlelight. Then, as quickly as it appeared, it went dark. He stood there for a while, staring at the empty town, wondering if he'd imagined it, but deep down, he knew he hadn't. When he got back to the cabin, the sun was low, bleeding through the trees. He spent the day patching small holes, sweeping dust, trying to make the place feel like his father might have wanted it. But that feeling, that presence never left. He'd glance over his shoulder and swear he saw a figure between the trees, standing just long enough for his brain to register the shape before it vanished again. That night, the stove was burning steady, the only source of light in the cabin. The air outside was sharp, filled with the kind of stillness that hurts your ears. Then came the sound. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, crunching the frozen leaves outside the door. He held his breath, trying to convince himself it was a deer. Then someone knocked, and a voice called out a man's voice. Calm, almost friendly. "Tom, you in there?" Elliot froze. Tom was his father's name. The knock came again, louder. "Tom, it's me. It's been a long time." Elliot stood, barely breathing. The voice was so confident, so casual, like it belonged there. Finally, he stepped closer to the door and said, "My dad's gone. Who are you?" There was a pause. A long, soft sigh. Then the voice changed. "I'm sorry to hear that, son. I was an old friend of your father's. Thought I might stop by." He said the man's tone didn't sound sad, didn't even sound human. It was too slow, like someone trying to mimic emotion but missing every note. And then the man said something else. Something that still makes Elliot shake when he remembers it. "Why don't you open up? We can talk about him by the fire. It's cold out here, son." Elliot said every instinct screamed at him to not move. He stepped back, away from the door. Then the knocks turned harder. The voice dropped lower. "You gonna let me freeze out here? That what your father would want?" He backed into the corner, hand trembling as he reached for the knife on his pack. The man outside started pounding the wood, over and over, his words twisting into angry growls that barely resembled language. Elliot wanted to run, but he knew stepping outside meant he'd never make it far. And then just like that silence, no more pounding, just the stove crackling again. He waited for what felt like hours before he heard the crunch of footsteps fading back into the trees. When the sun finally rose, Elliot gathered his things and left without looking back. He found his car untouched, hidden where he'd left it. But before starting the engine, he turned toward the woods one last time. He swears he saw someone standing there at the edge, a figure tall and still, watching him drive away. Later, he realized something strange. His father never talked about why he stopped visiting that cabin. Everyone assumed it was because the town died out. But Elliot now believes his father was running from something that knew his name and waited for him to return. He told me that when he dreams now, he sometimes hears the knock again. Same rhythm, same voice, but this time it says his name. By the time you hear the third story, you start to realize something. These cabins, no matter where they stand, always seem to pull in the same kind of silence. And inside that silence, something listens back. This one came from a man named Ryan. It was 2014. He was 21, taking a gap year from college, driving across the country out of his old sedan. When he reached the East Coast, his cousin offered him a place to stay for a few days, a modern cabin just south of the Appalachian Mountains. He thought it sounded perfect. A break from the car, from gas station food, from the constant motion. He imagined warm lights, clean air, peace. And that's how it started. Peace. Ryan said the cabin surprised him the moment he saw it. Glass windows, polished wood floors, even a small library. It didn't feel haunted or old. It felt safe. He could smell the pine outside, and the faint trace of coffee from whoever had stayed there last. For the first time in weeks, he felt human again. He unloaded his bags, humming to himself, and went back out to grab the last of his things from the car. That's when he saw the man. At first, it didn't even register as anything strange, just a shape standing between the trees, maybe 100 feet away. But the more Ryan looked, the clearer it became that the man wasn't doing anything. He wasn't hiking. He wasn't moving. He was watching. Ryan stood there, trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was a neighbor. Maybe the man was just cutting through the woods. But the longer he stayed still, the more obvious it became. There was nothing else for him to be looking at. Only Ryan. Only the cabin. He went back inside and locked the door, trying to laugh it off. He sent a quick text to his cousin. Got in fine. Place is awesome. Only weird thing, someone out there staring at the cabin. Maybe a neighbor? Then he unpacked, cooked some pasta, and turned on a movie to fill the air with sound. He didn't check his phone again until an hour later. His cousin's reply said, "There are no neighbors. The property's fenced 40 acres of private land. Shouldn't be anyone out there." Ryan's stomach dropped. He froze mid-bite, staring out the darkened window, but all he saw was his own reflection. The trees outside were swallowed by blackness. No movement. No face. Just him. He shut the curtains and tried to convince himself he'd misunderstood. But once that thought gets inside your head that someone's watching, you can't undo it. He tried to sleep but couldn't. Every little creak from the cabin floor made him hold his breath. Sometime past midnight, just as he was starting to drift off, he heard it. The faint sound of footsteps. Fast. Running. Right past the window. He jumped up, heart pounding. By the time he pulled the curtain aside, there was nothing there. No sound but the wind against the glass. No light but the pale outline of trees. He called his cousin in a panic. Cousin told him to hang up and call the police immediately, so he did. It took them nearly 30 minutes to arrive, and of course by then, whoever it was had vanished. No footprints, no signs of anyone. The officer walked around, flashlight cutting through the dark, but the woods seemed endless. "You're probably fine," he said, in that practiced tone of someone who doesn't believe their own words. "If anything happens again, call right away." Then he left, and the silence came back. Ryan thought about leaving that night, but he couldn't bring himself to go out there again. The idea of stepping into that darkness, carrying boxes to the car, turning his back on the woods, it felt worse than staying. So he stayed. He locked every door, checked every window, and sat in bed with his phone in hand, screen glowing like a tiny lifeline. But eventually, exhaustion won. He fell asleep sometime after 2. He woke up to nothing, just the wind, the room dim, the clock blinking 4:03 a.m. For a few seconds, he couldn't remember where he was. Then the dread hit again. He sat up, listening. The cabin creaked, the walls groaned. Then 3 soft thuds came from the far end of the hallway. Not the door, inside. He turned on the light. The hallway stretched long and narrow, leading toward the small library and kitchen. He saw something move, not fast, just a shadow gliding across the wall. He blinked, hoping it was his imagination. But then, at the end of the hallway, a figure stepped into view. The man from the trees. Same height, same outline, standing still. Ryan didn't wait. He turned, sprinted back into the bedroom, slammed the door, and locked it. The silence afterward was unbearable. He could hear his own breathing, the ticking of the clock, the faint rustle of the wind. Then came the footsteps. Slow, steady, moving down the hall, closer, closer, until they stopped right on the other side of the door. Ryan said he could feel the man's presence, the weight of him standing there. He didn't breathe for what felt like minutes. He thought about calling 911, but the sound might give him away. Instead, he looked at the window. It was small, but big enough. He made up his mind. He grabbed his keys, opened the latch, and climbed out. The cold air slapped his face. He hit the ground running, barefoot, sprinting toward his car parked in the gravel drive. He could hear something moving behind him, branches snapping, footsteps heavier now. He jumped into the car, slammed the door, and drove. He didn't look back, not once. When the police came later that morning, they found the bedroom window open and the front door unlocked. The man had come in through a broken latch on a side window. Whether it was already damaged or he'd broken it himself, they never figured out. But what mattered most was what they found inside the bedroom. The door lock, just one of those cheap push-button kinds, had been undone from the outside, meaning the man had a way in. He was waiting, and if Ryan hadn't jumped out that window when he did, he would have met him face to face. The strangest part? The police said there were traces of old footprints near the tree line, deep ones, layered over and over, as if someone had been pacing there for weeks, waiting for anyone to come, waiting for the lights to turn on again. Ryan doesn't travel alone anymore. He says sometimes when he parks by the woods, he still gets that feeling that something's standing just beyond the tree line, not moving, not breathing, just watching. And if you ever find yourself in a cabin out there in the Appalachians, and the night suddenly goes too quiet, close your curtains, because not everything in those woods wants to stay unseen. The woods have a way of holding on to stories, not in words, but in echoes. Every tree, every piece of old wood, every rotting cabin beam they remember. Maybe that's why these three stories feel connected, even though the people in them never met. Different mountains, different years, but the same feeling, the same silence that always comes before. Something steps out of it. Two brothers in Montana, standing face to face with a man who wasn't supposed to exist. A son, hearing his dead father's name whispered through a door that should have stayed shut, and a traveler, waking in the middle of the night to find that the thing watching him was already inside. Each of them came for peace. Each of them left with the same realization that the wilderness doesn't belong to us. It only tolerates us until it doesn't. People like to think monsters look a certain way. They don't. They don't crawl out of the ground or hide in fog. Sometimes they wear tattered clothes. Sometimes they knock on your door. Sometimes they just stand there, quiet, waiting for you to look back. And maybe that's what's most disturbing about these stories, because none of them ended with a clean explanation. The man in the Montana woods vanished. The stranger who knew Tom's name never found. The intruder near the Appalachians left no trail anyone could follow. 3 cabins, 3 survivors, and somewhere beyond the tree line, something that's still out there. I think that's the hardest part about these stories. The way they don't really end. They just stop, like the forest swallowed the rest of the sentences, like the silence came back and closed over the sound. But if you've ever spent a night deep in the woods, far from roads and cell towers, you know what I mean when I say the quiet isn't empty. It listens. It shifts. Sometimes you wake up and swear you heard something moving just outside. Sometimes you hear your name. Sometimes you convince yourself it's nothing because the alternative is too heavy to live with. If you ever find yourself in a cabin like that alone, in the dark, surrounded by miles of forest, remember this. Lock the doors, keep the fire burning, and if you hear someone knocking, don't answer, because maybe it's not a stranger at all. Maybe it's the same silence that's been waiting for everyone who ever wandered too far into the trees. The same silence that took their voices and left their stories behind. And when the night goes completely still, when even the wind dies and the world feels like it's holding its breath, that's not peace. That's warning. That's the sound of the forest remembering your name.